Hello friends, welcome to the EduSat Network. Our today's topic of discussion is 20th Century Indian Writing, a Perspective. And for this discussion, we have with us in our studio our subject expert Dr. Anand Prakash, retired professor of English literature. He has a teaching experience of 4 decades and currently he is editing the Journal of Drama Studies, an international journal of research on world drama, and the Hindi journal Yug Paribodh. A poet and theatre person, Anand Prakash has scripted plays in English and Hindi. These have been staged in Delhi's Shri Ram Centre and performed in Delhi slums. And with this brief introduction, I would like to welcome Sir to our EduSat studio. Thank you for coming, Sir. And with this, I request you to also begin our today's lecture, Sir.
Thank you, Urvashi. This lecture has a subject which is wide-ranging. And in view of this, I would be making some general points. It's a perspective that I'm giving. And initially, I have to explain also, viewers, for your, I have to share with you the idea that I have of perspective, so that one knows what one is doing while speaking and addressing an audience. A perspective is the angle. It's the position from which the picture is captured. And we generally think that a picture is complete, it tells everything. But if you critically look at the picture, you would realize that a picture is never complete. A picture always hides somewhere an angle, somewhere a position from where the picture is taken. There are many things which the picture doesn't capture, because the person who had that perspective did not want those things to appear in the picture at all. And there are certain others which are emphasized, which are focused upon in the picture, and these are the pictures that the photographer or the painter wanted the viewer to look at. So there's an element of selection in the making of a picture, and that selection comes from the angle and the position that the speaker, that the viewer, that the painter, that the writer, etc., has. Therefore, it's important that today we talk about, the angle, the position that appeared in the 20th century literature, the way the writers looked at their reality, the position that they took, and how that affected the life in general in India. And specifically, this is the 20th century, picture that I'm going to talk about. Literature in the 20th century is totally, entirely different from the 19th century and the centuries before. And there are certain reasons for this. And this makes it necessary for us to, identify the difference between literature of the 19th century and the 20th century. Of course, when I say 19th and 20th centuries, I do not make a very clear distinction, because time cannot be divided, entirely, into segments which could be covered under one century or the other. I'm not saying literally, for instance, that things changed in 1900 and that before that they were entirely different. What I'm saying is that the 100 years before the 20th century began had a kind of literature, which confined itself either to the folk or to the upper classes, the ruling classes. And in fact, there was no, factually speaking, middle class in India at that time. There were some, sections of the middle class in urban centers, but the way we understand the term today, that kind of middle class was not there. And most of the literature of the 19th century was limited to the celebration or observation of certain rituals, certain religious occurrences and happenings. And people were mostly believers, they were illiterate, they would not read literature, they would see literature in action on the stage sometimes, or they heard songs sung by people at that time, the singers, or there might have been kirtans where a religious kind of literature was presented. And of course, in Urdu there were poets, who sat in a corner of their house and, composed poetry and then that poetry was recited before a select audience. So that was the kind of elite section of society which enjoyed ghazals, for instance, at that time. And from there on to the 20th century, the scene completely changes. So I'll talk about this scene today, and I'll just make a few general points. And the first general point that I make is that India's writing in India, Indian literature in the 20th century and before that also, has never been one and unified. So you can't say that there is this Indian literature. In fact, when we say literature, then we mean different strands of literature, or literatures in the plural. And why so? And the reason is that India, in certain respects, is more than a country. It's a continent. It's a subcontinent, as it is generally called. And in this subcontinent called India, which is a country, of course, for all purposes, in this country there are regions which do not generally interact with one another till the beginning of the 20th century. They remain isolated, they remain alienated, they are independent, they are exclusive, they do not know what is happening outside that region, and therefore whatever written things appear in a particular region do not seem to have any influence from other regions. And in fact, the languages are different. India doesn't have one unifying language. There was a process in which a language started emerging in the 20th century, but till the 20th century began, India did not have a single or just a few languages, but a large number of languages. And since India was divided into regions, therefore these languages also had their own character and their own shape, and then there would be their own traditions to follow and to propagate through writing. So I say that India till the beginning of the 20th century is a land of linguistic and cultural diversities. Linguistic diversities, it has many languages, and those languages, some of them have roots in Sanskrit, some might have roots in Persian, some other languages maybe just spoken there, so they are not language in that sense. They are dialects which people speak and keep on changing from one part of the region to another. And then there are cultural diversities, in the sense that there are religious, moral principles that one region has and the other region does not have. And these cultural principles are very important for the shaping of belief, for the shaping of faith, for the shaping of the aesthetic judgment, and therefore culture. So there are a large number of cultures and there are a large number of languages. And when you talk of Indian writing then in the 20th century, then you realize that perhaps some change is occurring somewhere which is bringing these different cultures closer to one another, and regions also get gradually unified into what will later on be called as the Indian nation. So we should recognize this fact and then see that the Indian writing actually constitutes a large number of traditions, a large number of bodies of writing, emotions and sentiments which are popular at one place may not be popular at another place, and so on and so forth. A few major languages in which literature evolved in the 20th century in a major way would be, I'm just going alphabetically, Assamese, for instance. There is a different kind of a literature. It has the flavor of life in the northeast region. Then there is Bangla. That what we call Bengal is divided. One part is with India and the other part is an independent country. But linguistically they are very close to each other. And within India, the Bengal part has in fact one of the most advanced literary writing. In northern India, writing would have begun in the modern sense much later, but so far as Bengal is concerned, the literary tradition of the modern kind appeared in the initial decades of the 19th century itself. And there is a phenomena you might have heard of, viewers. That phenomena is called Bengal Renaissance, and this Bengal Renaissance brought in, fresh air into the climate of culture at that point of time, and modern ideas, were introduced in Bangla literary perception. A different kind of poetry, different kind of prose also appeared, and people started not talking merely of reform under the influence of Bengal Renaissance, but they started, talking of modern times, and they would criticize, certain things which had become ossified and rigid in Bengal at that time, and they said, now let us look towards anywhere in the world where change is occurring, and we should be inspired by change. Now, Bengal Renaissance produced a big chunk of literary writing in the early years of the 19th century itself, and interestingly, some of this writing was there in the English language, which was becoming somewhat popular in the early 19th century. And there's no point in naming names, but then this Bengal Renaissance later on gave rise to a whole new tradition of writing that would be rooted in the Indian conditions and life, and the Bangla language in the middle years of the 19th century would become a major vehicle of literary expression. And when the 20th century comes, then Bengali literature is one of the literatures that is far ahead of many others. Then you have Gujarati. Gandhiji, for instance, went from Gujarat in the 19th century to study, in England, and he may not be just one person going out from there to study or to see new climes and new cultures. So there was a trend in Gujarat, for instance, to go towards the west, learn things from there, and then come back. And you can see it in the behavior and actions of Gandhiji himself, that he went away as a Gujarati and came back as a nationalist, as a great humanist. So that kind of modernity which Gandhiji represents in the 19th century and in the 20th century, that kind of modernity actually belongs to Gujarati culture and language, and literature in Gujarat once again is quite advanced. Then you have Hindi. The Hindi case is very different from other languages. In the 18th century, Hindi is used. The word Hindi is used by certain Urdu poets, and in the 19th century, Hindi actually becomes Khadi Boli, and Urdu also is Khadi Boli. So one is using the two languages, the names of two languages interchangeably. So it's Hindi and Urdu, and you can be an Urdu poet or a Hindi poet in the 19th century without bothering about the vocabulary, without bothering about the ideas, without bothering about the identity of the person who is writing, etc. So that case is quite different. In fact, the way we speak Hindi in the 20th century, particularly with respect to literature, that kind of Hindi is not there in the 19th century. In fact, there is a spoken kind of expression in the 19th century Hindi, and it is an amalgam. It's a combination of different dialects of North India. So Hindi is very close to Avadhi, for instance. Hindi is not Avadhi, but then people speak Avadhi at home, and when they write in Hindi. People also write at the same time in Avadhi and Urdu, or speak Avadhi and write Urdu. And that I'll maybe talking about the case of Premchand, who belonged to Awadh, and who wrote in Urdu initially, and then consciously towards the end of the beginning of the 20th century, Premchand somehow realizes that with the adoption of Hindi in the contemporary form, in the form in which it existed at that point of time, will take him to a larger audience, and therefore he decides to become bilingual. So he will write in both the languages. He will be published in both the languages simultaneously. So you have an Urdu version of his fiction, and you have a Hindi version of his fiction, And Premchand, in fact, who didn't know Hindi initially, would learn Hindi gradually. And viewers, then if you have an old edition of Premchand's books, then sometimes the word Premchand is written in a kind of Hindi that a child in the primary school would write one's name. It is that kind of unsteady hand that Premchand had with respect to writing Hindi. And when you see his Urdu writing, then you know the kind of flow that is there, with the hand that he uses. So which means that he is deeply, embedded in the culture of, what is today called Urdu at that point of time. And then he is gradually coming out of it, or at least he is catering to the audience in both the languages. So that case is Hindi. So Hindi actually is not there in the form in which it became later, but in the 19th century, you can see the evolution of a language from almost a scratch. The scratch I refer to is Khadi Boli, and that Khadi Boli is obviously Boli, it is spoken, and then people start writing in the Devanagari script, which is finally standardized, and that becomes Hindi in the 20th century. And in passing, let me also tell you that Hindi in the first half of the 20th century is in fact the virtual link language. This language is not, of course, spoken all over India, but then important leaders of the national movement, they used Hindi for expressing their views. Gandhiji, for instance, who would talk in Hindi. Rajgopalachari from Tamil Nadu, he would talk in Hindi. In fact, he was one of the functionaries of some institution that was known by with the word Hindi. It was supposed to propagate. I think it's Hindi Pracharani or some such word. I don't get the exact one. And people in Bihar, of course, they would stress upon the use of Hindi more and more, even though they have their own developed languages like Maithili and Bhojpuri. And UP has what is Uttar Pradesh today. It has Awadhi and it has Braj, etc. But then and Urdu, but then finally they adopt Hindi. So it's a kind of virtual link language at that time. And interestingly, again, maybe even significantly, English is not to be seen in the kind of link role that it came to adopt later. But I don't want to complicate matters in the beginning. So I say that Hindi is another major language with its own literature, and that literature is different from what it was in the 19th century. Then you have Malayalam. Malayalam is a very, very boisterous, very, very robust language. You have Marathi, you have Tamil, you have Telugu, and all of them have their own cultures to project and their own points of view and discourses to share with the reader. And of course, I'm not much conversant with the literatures of all these languages, but I have in translation read a few pieces from each one of them, and I realized that there are many common things that appear in this writing in different languages, which can be termed Indian writing in the 20th century. Now I in fact come to this point in order to tell you as to what makes 20th century literature distinct. For instance, in the 20th century, the distinction is earned by that writing which is modern in its approach. And modern is not a difficult word to understand in the 20th century. It's not. It doesn't have many interpretations. Modern is that which is anti-old, which is anti-orthodox, which is anti-ritualistic. Modern is that which talks about the present conditions. Modern is that which is open to ideas from anywhere in the world, particularly the West, because West was ahead of us in terms of modernity. So we would not mind taking influences from the West in the 20th century. And in some of the literary forms that became popular in India at that point of time were the literary forms that actually had already established themselves in Europe and England in particular. There is not much of novel writing in India in the 19th century, and on the other side in the West, novel has not only established itself as a form, but has in fact started declining, as some people say. So novel is very rich in its content and very wide in its appeal in the 18th and 19th centuries, but then around the middle of the 19th century, the novel becomes somewhat, static and doesn't evolve any further. This is the opinion of some leading critics of Western fiction. But so far as India is concerned, the novel is taking shape in the 20th century. Before the 20th century, there are certain novelists, of course. There is Bankim Chandra, for instance, in Bangla, and there is Tagore in Bangla, and there are certain writers in other languages. But then they adopt the novel as something new, as something interesting, as something meaningful in their own case. And the novel will become what it is today only in the first few decades of the 20th century. So one knows, that the novel is a vehicle of modernity, so far as India is concerned. It might have outlived its utility in Western literature in the 19th century. But then, so far as India is concerned, novel is one thing, that writers aspire to express themselves through. And therefore, this is a kind of a gift of modern Europe to Indian writing, that the inspiration of writing a novel comes from the West. I don't say the same thing about short stories, because India has a long and rich tradition of short stories from the ancient period itself. One has to refer to Jataka tales, one has to refer to Panchatantra, one has to refer to other texts, other classical texts of the time. And there are India is a land of stories, in fact. So short stories are there. But the way short story forms itself in the 20th century in literatures all over the different languages, that short story must have taken some help, from Western short story. Of course, in Indian short stories, barring a few exceptions in the West and in Russia, Indian short story is much more varied, much more, culturally strong and a vehicle of expression than short story elsewhere. And this emphasis on modernity in the context of Indian writing actually is an integral part of the emphasis that freedom struggle, in fact, lay upon it. For instance, if India had not decided, if the different regions and parts of India had not decided to unite nationally against a foreign power, India would not have had all this resurgence, all this modernity, because in order to unite against a common enemy from outside, one required ideas that were not there in India at that point of time. How does one sympathize, for instance, with a person in India coming from a different region? One should give arguments in favor of this. And of course, the argument would be that whether it's the eastern, person from the east, or person from the south in India, or person from the western India, etc., all of them are Indians because all of them are human, all of them work, all of them are oppressed, all of them are victims of injustice. And these new ideas, victim of injustice, oppression, these new ideas in fact compel the Indians to come together against a common enemy which represents and symbolizes injustice. So that way modern ideas compel people to unite and to struggle against a common enemy. And in order to struggle against a common enemy, you write a different kind of a literature, which is human-centered, which talks about people, doesn't divide people in terms of castes, but in fact tells people that whatever your caste, you are an Indian. Whatever my caste, I am an Indian. So in a way, indirectly, it's a critique of what India held as, belief systems in the 19th century. Because you are a modern person, and because you have to communicate modern ideas, new ideas, and because you have to get united in order to fight a common enemy, therefore, there will be a kind of modernity that will bind this country together and produce a literature, which will be totally different from the one that existed earlier. I think now maybe Urvashi would have to make a comment or an observation or maybe ask a question.
Absolutely, sir. I was waiting for an opportunity. And sir, you said that literature in of the 19th century is different from that of the 20th century, and you also mentioned that the scene when 20th century came, it completely changed. And I was wondering why this happened and why there was such a big difference. And of course there's 100 years in between, but why there was this stark difference. And you told us that the literature of 19th century was confined to that of the folk and also the ruling class, and so the subjects also adopted and written about were quite different. Say you told us that
yes.
to the observation and celebration of festivals or songs or kirtans, and so can we say that in the 20th century it's as you also mentioned, because of the freedom struggle that and the element of modernity, the modern ideas which came in, that this new kind of literature emerged. Can we say that, sir?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying, and you have got it right. It is also that once you start writing that kind of a literature, then the conditions which produced it, those conditions are all changed. There's a two-way process. You write, and when you write, then you make an impact on those forces which compel you to write in the first place. So that way things happen. So freedom struggle compels people to write a different kind of literature, and when you write a different kind of a literature, then freedom struggle gets strengthened. And inspires more. For instance, it would be unthinkable, viewers, that in the 19th century, the writer would talk about, equality, or would talk about, rising in some kind of resistance or revolt against the king. The king is supposed to be the father. The king is supposed to be my Baap. Is supposed to be the Annadata. In fact, in the 19th century, even the British rulers were supposed to be my Baap and Annadata. This is the kind of language. But when new ideas come, then somebody can say that this land is ours, this country belongs to us, and that we are its makers, and we know the tradition better than the supposed my Baap and Annadata. Therefore, when these new ideas come, then you want to express yourself, through a language which will, help you communicate with people more effectively, and that language has to be coined to a large extent, has to be forged as a kind of a political or cultural weapon, and that's what is actually happening. So one sees that when this kind of ideas, this set of ideas, comes to the Indians, then Indians start thinking of having new words, having new sentence structures, having new kind of poetry, having new kind of songs, etc., new kind of writing, in fact. And that's how the whole spectrum has this kind of a richness of give and take and of expressing oneself in a more emphatic language than before. So this is exactly as Uroshi has said. This is the point that I'm making, and I'm happy that this point gets across like this to viewers, to most of us, I hope. And so there is modernity gives us a kind of Indianness. So imagine, it's a very paradoxical thing that the modern ideas come from the scientific thinking that developed in the West, and when those ideas reach us, then those ideas make us Indians. So we become Indians because we get more and more integrated with the regions which are far away from us, and we start interacting with them, and the interaction happens in a geographical boundary, in a place which is surrounded by the geographical boundary, and separating us from other parts of the world. And within this geographical boundary, we start becoming united, and we start evolving our own language and culture, and that is what we call Indian. And this Indianness actually is not the kind of Indianness that we understand today, that we are a great nation or a great country. This Indianness is important in the pre-independence period for the reason that it is pitched against a foreign power. So our identity of Indianness emanates from, it arises from our struggle against an imperialist power. So we are Indians, and the imperialist power is an alien agent, and therefore we have to fight it and resist it. So today we, of course, when we call of India, then we go back to the ancient times. There might have been some people in the early 20th century who would also go back to the ancient times, but then unless we united at that time against a foreign power, we would not have called ourselves Indians. So this is the secular idea of Indianness. The idea of Indianness that says that we will decide our own destiny and we will govern our own actions, and within India we will do it as Indians. And there is a kind of equality also associated with Indianness, which is not there in India's history. We understand the term equality, because we can unite with people of another region only when we tell them, and they tell us and they assure us that all of us are Indians and therefore we are equal. So in fact, Indianness and equality also become synonymous terms at that point of time. So this is the point I'm making with respect to the languages and cultures and literatures that appeared in the 20th century, particularly in the first 4 or 5 decades. Then have we achieved Indianness yet? This is a question, viewers, that you and I can grapple with. We still have Indianness. I made this note which I prepared for the lecture today. I made this note that Indianness emerges, but it goes on developing more and more, and it is today also a vision and a goal with us. And the vision and goal, would make us, believe in ourselves, and we have to think of an India, which treats our different regions and cultures and religions, faith systems, belief systems, etc., in the democratic sense together. No, not in the dictatorial sense that I am an Indian and you are not an Indian, but in the sense that I am an Indian, you are also an Indian, and that different, cultures will not and should not be allowed to face erosion. Those cultures should be preserved in their humanistic form, so that they become still closer with one another and they learn to coexist under a system of tolerance. So this is what Indianness is. This is what Indianness was produced here in the pre-independence period, in the phase of freedom struggle, and that Indianness we have still to earn further. In fact, before I move on to the next point, I'll share this with you, that we have that less kind of Indianness today than we had till 1947, and the reason is that the emphasis on equality is not as much as it was there in the days of the freedom struggle. Then the peasant in the village who would feel a part of the larger country. Peasant revolts happened. Gandhiji, in fact, in the second and third decades of the 20th century, he appealed not to the middle classes as much as to the peasants to come and join him, and Chauri Chaura and all those things happened. So peasants were a part of the Indian freedom struggle then, and most of the writing of most of the writing in India at that time in different languages, that writing was not confined to the middle class, to the educated intelligence at that time. It was in fact covering large chunks of peasantry at that time. You think of the Odia literature, you think of northeastern literature, which projected the tribal life and the peasant life and the workers' life, etc. So all these things were there at that time, and we should learn from them and preserve and project them further. So Indianness still is not an achieved goal. Indianness is something that we have to keep on working for, so that finally we understand Indianness in the context of preserving, maintaining, and tolerating, living with diversities and differences. So that is what I believe is Indianness, and that is the strength of the 20th century writing. That Indian writing allows different discourses to coexist with one another in a framework of democracy. And this is a hallmark, and in fact Indian literature stands tall in this sense vis-a-vis literatures of the West. In fact, I don't have any inhibition in saying, viewers, that in the 20th century Western writers talked about modernism, and by modernism they meant that they were lonely and they were solitary and they were all the time oppressed and they were losing identity. When Western writers were saying that we are alien and we are alienated and we are helpless and all, Indian writers were saying we are working together and we are fighting. So imagine Premchand and T.S. Eliot, I said in another lecture also, Premchand and T.S. Eliot are exact contemporaries. And see the difference in their writing. And this writing is different because in the 20th century, Indian writing has in fact produced a glorious tradition of tolerance, peace, and struggle for justice. So these things are contributory to the kind of Indian writing that I am sharing with you, for understanding. Then I go over developments in poetry in the 20th century first, then I will come to fiction and finally to drama and to other things, and first poetry. What kind of poetry was written in the 20th century? Now I am just picking up at random poets from different languages here, and maybe I would comment on these briefly. One, we have Tagore in poetry, one of the first. We have Maithili Sharan Gupta, a Hindi writer, who is called Rashtra Kavi in the discussions about Hindi literature, and who talks about his own language and his own culture and his own country, and who writes like a propagandist. Today we all say that literature is not propaganda, or literature is weakened by propaganda. But then this great writer, at that point of time decided to propagate modern secular views among the vast majority of readers, and that he did through, for instance, there is a book called Bharat Bharati. Now imagine a book at that point of time. This book is composed sometime between 1910, around 1910, and in this book, he's talking about, the nation. And it's a very bold and a very courageous idea at that point of time to talk about a nation, because this is the word is anathema to the British rulers then, and he defines the nation, and then he also in other writings of his reinterprets some of the old classics, and in those classics, viewers, you will be surprised to see that there's an emphasis on the dignity of women in his writing. For instance, he writes his own kind of Ramayana. It's not called Ramayana, it is called Saket. There's a famous long poem, about 400-500 pages, and in this poem he makes of the narrative, the heroine, Lakshman's wife is presented as the heroine of Saket, Urmila. So it's not Sita. Sita is there, of course, and Sita is quite respectable there. But then he's telling us that there is a woman who was left behind by her husband, and then the husband went away for 14 years, and this woman will be fending for herself, and he would sympathize with this woman, and he would project her as a very important character in one of his poems. The same thing happened in the case of Gautam Buddha. Gautam Buddha went away, but he went away after marriage. And of course, he doesn't mean any disrespect to Gautam Buddha. Gautam Buddha is the hero of Maithili Sharan Gupta. But then he points out to the loneliness and to the helplessness of the woman who was bringing up the child, the son of Gautam Buddha. It's, I think, Rahul or somebody. That's the name, perhaps. So the woman and the child, they are at home, and they are waiting for these, the Buddha to come back, and they talk about him and all. And Maithili Sharan Gupta had this moral courage, literary courage, to emphasize the helplessness and the pain and the suffering and the courage at the same time of women characters in the old epics. Then you have Subramanian Bharati, a Tamil poet who also writes in English, and he is a great nationalist voice, in Indian writing, and his writing is not looked upon, kindly by the British authorities. So at some point of time in his life, he has to leave that part of India which is governed by the Britishers, and wherever he goes, I think he went to Pondicherry, and there was a different kind of regime, and but the spies were after him. So he came back and he changed his stance a bit, and then he was somewhat safe. But then this person had the courage to express the nationalist sentiment and the life that he saw and lived in what is today Tamil Nadu, and he was a fearless writer, and his poetry is a source of inspiration for most of the readers now, and it was. In fact, I read a few articles, and there is a renewed interest in his writing today, Subramanian Bharati, and the person was that way representative of the voice of resistance in India in the early years of the 20th century. Then you have Mahadevi Verma, a Hindi writer, who wrote lyrics and sometimes even longer poems and prose also. Longer poems she didn't write much, but yes, some poems would be just lyrics and some others would be longer than that. Then you have and Mahadevi Verma, a woman, coming forward and writing and asserting her womanly identity. This is not easy to explain, in terms of the rise of women in the 20th century, and the kind of feminism that she practiced through her writing and through her life activities. For instance, she took upon herself the responsibility of educating the women, in her area. You also have Subhadra Kumari Chauhan, a person who once again propagated the cause of nationalism. That famous poem, Khoob Ladi Mardani, wo to Jhansi wali Rani thi, and Jhansi Rani wali took part in the 1857 revolt. And this lady, Subhadra Kumari Chauhan, he wrote a poem, and it was, popular among a vast majority of readers in North India. Then you have in Urdu, you have Faiz Ahmad Faiz, who is writing in the 1930s, 40s, and later. He was around till the 1980s, a Marxist poet. Then you have Mukti Bodh, another Marxist poet who started writing in the 1930s and wrote till his last breath in 1964. You have Shri Shri, he is from Telugu. Then you have Majaz from Urdu. You have Sahir from Urdu. Nissim Ezekiel from Bombay. Of course, he comes later than the national movement has finally concluded in the gaining of independence by India. But then in the 20th century, and you have Kamala Das, another person who is a feminist, and she wrote in the post-independence period. So these poets, in their own specific ways, took up different themes, and all themes were informed by what I have called modernity. So you would not accuse them. You would not, say that these people, propagated any kind of tradition. In fact, they always were skeptical about the traditional methods of, living life, and they thought that everything has to be critically examined and seen for its humanist content. I started with Tagore, reference to Tagore, and one knows, that Tagore always preferred focusing upon the ordinary masses, the ordinary women, and the helpless. And all of us have heard about that famous story, Kabuliwala. So there is a person who comes from outside. He spends most of his time in India, and he has left a family behind somewhere in Afghanistan. So the pains of people coming from different parts of what I call the subcontinent, they came and they played their role and they went back, and their pains and sufferings were captured by the writers of the 20th century that I mentioned here. Then there was a trend in the 20th century, and that trend was of Romanticism and modernity. Modernity I already explained to you, but then I can talk about Romanticism a bit. Indian writers learnt of Romanticism from English Romanticism. And in fact, in the 19th century, people like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Shelley, Byron, these have become quite popular, and they were translated into Indian languages, and they were so popular, in fact, in India in the early 20th century, that in Hindi in particular, their influence was reflected in the coming up of a whole trend called Chayavad. So one wonders why the Romanticism was translated as Chayavad. Maybe there was some idea about imagination, which is Chaya, it's not reality. And then, this Chayavad was also modern in the sense, that it did not bother much about the oppression of society coming from different quarters and structures. And Chayavad revolted against them the same way the Romanticism revolted against the social and other structures obtaining in England at that time. And well, there are poets of Chayavad in Hindi, and I can name them. Madhavi Verma is one poet who is supposed to be a Chayavadi poet. You have also poets like Sumitranandan Pant, a person coming from the hills and talking about nature, and for him nature is everything. He is a great nature worshipper, the same way as perhaps Wordsworth was. He is influenced by Wordsworth and others. And you have Nirala, the poet who was a great humanist and who came quite close to Marxism in the 1940s and 50s. And you have Jayashankar Prasad, who thought of reinterpreting some of the old classics. And these people used imagination to understand some of the hidden layers of experience in India, and therefore, you know, they are remembered today as great romantics. If there is something that you would like to...
Definitely, sir. Sir, as we just talked about that the Indian concept of modernism and the English modernism were, say, quite different, that the Indian one was a glorious tradition of tolerance, peace and unity when the freedom struggle was being fought, and the modernity that could be seen within the writing and say within the, say, as a general feeling amongst people. So then was the Romanticism that was adopted also different in a certain sense from the English Romanticism that came in India?
Yes, of course. You see, first let me address this question of modernism and modernity. Now, these are two different terms, in fact. So, when I said something about the English writing in the 20th century, then I used the word modernism. And that modernism is not modern at all. In fact, modernism in its avatar, in its English avatar in the 20th century, talks more about tradition. Now one of the greatest modernists of English literature, that is T.S. Eliot, he talks of tradition. His famous essays of tradition and the individual talent. So he's not talking about modern view, modern ideas or modernity. Modernity is that, you know, which continuously learns from experience and from other quarters in society and life, and it keeps on growing. That is modernity. So today also we should remain modern, and tomorrow we should be more modern than today. So modern in the sense that we learn and we evolve from our learning. That is modernity. So far as modernism is concerned, that is confined to the understanding of capitalism or industrialism. And modernism in fact accepts industrialism as a fact, and then it says we are helpless against it. So that way modernism doesn't see any kind of a connection between one individual and another. Because when you go to the factory and when you come back, you are tired, you don't have any social life, and you can't do anything beyond, you know, the getting of money and buying and selling goods. So that is modernism, the experience of helplessness, the experience of stasis, lack of movement. But modernity is that which straight away connects us with Renaissance, which connects us with Romanticism. That is a part of modernity. Romantics in the 19th century were great critics of the 18th century, and Wordsworth, in fact, his statement about the 18th century in that famous preface to the lyrical ballads talks about total rejection of the 18th century ethos. So they were rebels. For instance, Shelley was more of a socialist than many others of the time. So these people were critics of society, and they were critics of old traditions. So that kind of modernity should be imbibed by, and in fact was imbibed from the Romantics by the Indian writers. So Indian Romanticism that way made it more socially based than the Romanticism of the, it was not escapist as some people call it, and maybe some kind of charges leveled against that 19th century English Romanticism, that they were escapists. But what Chayavadis were sometimes called escapists, then they were gradually moving from the modern ideas to the social ideas. In fact, I said that Nirala came very close to the Marxist understanding of society, and even Pant, for instance, Sumitranandan Pant, he came quite close to writing about the village life and the villagers and their pains and sufferings. So that is a contribution of the 20th century Indian sensitivity to life, in the writing that comes under the Indian Romanticism. So there are differences, and there's a point of inspiration from there. And the second question related to you asked what?
Sir, I simply asked this idea that whether, say, the Romanticism that was happening in England and Europe, was it adopted in the same way in India? Were there any differences?
It was not adopted in the same way. You are right in raising this question. It was not adopted in the same way. In fact, this was liked by Indians. It suited Indians to use their imagination to understand things. And the emphasis of Romanticism on imagination that helped Indians understand their situation better. To that extent, they were quite close to the Indian English Romantics. At the same time, though, since India was fighting a different kind of a battle than the Romantics were fighting in England, therefore, many of the writers, Chayawadi writers in Hindi, they crossed boundaries of Romanticism and came over to social ideas and to socialism. So that's the difference. The difference is that they broadly or even directly became part of the freedom struggle in India with the passage of time. So that's where the difference lies. Since now we are coming to the close of the lecture, there is a time constraint. So I'll perhaps stop at the end of the point that relates to poetry, because other points can be maybe discussed later sometime. So I say the second thing that I say about poetry is that there is a nationalist assertion here that Indians, they start saying through poetry, Indian writers start saying through poetry that they want independence, that they want to fight the foreign oppressor, and it's very difficult to contain them for the regime, because the voice is increasing by the day. Then the 20th century poetry also talks about the reinterpretation of the past to hoist sense of superiority. For instance, one should not be ashamed of one's past, and Indian past has been quite glorious in certain respects. So they evoked the epic heroes and they reworked them in their poetry. There is the case of the great Indian Hindi romantic Jayashankar Prasad, who wrote his own Kamayani, and in the Kamayani he talks about how human beings finally moved around and became human in the course of interaction with one another. In Kamayani, at one point of time only one person is left after the flood, and then he meets a woman, and then of course it's the Adam and Eve story reworked in the case of India. Then you have in the 20th century, at the level of form and aesthetics also, there are experiments. I would finish with this, and the experiment with form in India occurs in the case of blank verse and free verse. So blank verse, viewers, is that where the meter is maintained, meter is used, but the rhyming scheme is left out. That is blank verse, and in English you have the blank verse starting from Christopher Marlowe and Shakespeare. It goes through Milton and Wordsworth and all, and it's a major literary meter. We have the blank verse in India, the use of the blank verse, particularly in Urdu. Iqbal is one of the pioneers of blank verse. He makes it a kind of he writes the longer poem also. The long poem he uses on the strength of the blank verse, and writes powerful literature. Then there is free verse. These days, almost every poet in India would be using free verse. They have already discarded the meter, and discarding the meter actually symbolized in the 20th century poetry discarding of tradition. So you would not write in the established forms. In fact, you will go against any kind of established form. So that kind of a revolt and rebellion against traditional form also got reflected at the level of genre. So most poets today, they would write a short sentence and a long sentence, and it goes on and on like this. And sometimes you can't separate the prose rhythms from poetic rhythms, etc. In fact, that is the virtue of blank verse also. but blank verse still retains meter, and in India, finally, it came to to free verse, where writing could be done through the speech rhythms. Rhythms are there, but the fixed pattern is not there. Nirala is one of the pioneers so far as use of free verse is concerned, and Nirala in Hindi was attacked critically by a large number of people who said that poetry without rhyme or without a meter is no poetry at all. But finally, Nirala and other poets who followed him, they prevailed. Muktibodh is a great user of the free verse. He uses rhythms of all kinds, but finally the free verse asserts itself. So yes, with this we come to the end of the discussion, and I would now request Durvashi to
thank you thank you so much, sir. Absolutely, sir, and very wonderfully concluded, and also very interesting lecture. So we got an interesting perspective into 20th century Indian writing, and we also saw how the transition happened, and also the element of say modernity that and the Indianness that we are still searching for. So with this trend, I would like to thank sir for being here and sparing his valuable time, and also our viewers for watching and staying tuned in, and wish you a wonderful day. Thank you so much, sir.